Colton arrived to our NICU, transported from an outside community hospital, and we knew he was very sick. He was basically from a neurologic status in what one might call a coma. He was being supported by ventilators and getting IV fluids. The biggest question right away was, at some level, is this even a survivable condition because of his state?
Many of the guidelines in other countries would recommend stopping care in a child who's as sick as Colton was when he arrived. There'd been brief conversations at some of the meetings that the metabolic doctors have when they get together about once a year to talk about the new things in metabolic diseases that suggested maybe this idea of cooling might help.
Cooling is in the neonatal unit. We've done it now for some time, and it's standard of care for babies who have potential injury from a lack of oxygen from birth trauma or other problems. The procedure itself is not experimental. It's just experimental in this clinical situation.
I tried to reach out to some of my colleagues to see whether or not we could find somebody who'd done this and see whether it worked or not, and if they had a standard way of doing it. Really kind of during the time that Colton arrived, we still had no contacts back, so I actually telephoned one of my colleagues in Washington, D.C. and spoke with her, and she actually said that they had a protocol in place, a research protocol in place, and she called at home kind of this early on a Sunday morning. The doctor who was in charge of that study, that doctor called me back, provided us electronically with their protocol. So one of the differences with cooling with the kids with the urea cycle defects than a kid that we're cooling because they've had a lack of oxygen is we're actually doing dialysis. And so the dialysis circuit itself actually cools the blood almost to room temperature anyway. So during the initial phase of cooling off, the babies cool off very rapidly just by the dialysis circuit. But once we're done with the rapid dialysis, which is about 4 to 6 hours, and then onto the maintenance phase for another 6 to 8 hours, we're then much more dependent on the cooling blankets, the standard ways of keeping the baby cool. For this protocol, we kept Colton cool for 3 days, and then we gradually warmed him up. So he is not cool off to room temperature, but it's actually about halfway between room temperature and what a normal body temperature would be. As we weren't expecting, his ammonia levels, we were able to clear his ammonia much faster because his whole metabolism was slowed down by being cooler. As we expected, his heart had a little bit more trouble because it doesn't pump as well when it's cooler, and his blood vessels don't keep the liquid in the blood in as well, so he became very swollen. Prior to coming to the hospital, he had a blood vessel in his brain clot, and so he had a big clot in his blood vessel, so one of the other things we had to manage whilst he was cool and warmed up was actually trying to dissolve the clot in his brain as well. And then the other things, we were keeping a constant eye on his brain waves. We had things called EEGs, so little electrodes on his brain looking at how his brain was working the whole 3 days, and as we warmed him up. He had abnormal activity consistent with seizures, which is typically an extremely poor indicator of how well a baby is going to do when they recover from a high ammonia episode. There are 6 children in the world that have had this cooling procedure done for high ammonias. We expect that about half of the children with ammonias this high will die, and of those that survive, about 2/3 will have very severe neurological problems. Of the 6 children that have been through this cooling procedure, all 6 of them survived. And of those 6 that survived, 5 out of the 6 have had very good neurological outcomes, and Colton actually is doing the least well of the 6 children that cooled, and he is doing way, way better than we would expect given the state that he was in when he arrived, the fact that his heart had stopped, and the fact that he had a blood clot in his brain. It's incredible to see how good he's doing in terms of progress.